When making my second Rita Repulsa dress for the Lightning Collection figure, I ended up with this fabric from a website called My Fabrics, and for £8 and 18 pence, I'm getting some content out of it. Now, this fabric reminded me of Hisuian Voltorb from Pokemon Legends Arceus, and I've got some scrap fabric lying around, so I thought I'd make Hisuian Voltorb. You know, assuming the title of this video didn't give that away at all. Not sure if you could tell. Now for the sewing pattern, this was nice as Voltorb is a ball, so a sewing pattern was readily available online. This is the sewing pattern I used, and I found it on Pinterest. The reason I went with a 4-panel sewing pattern sphere is because I needed it to be an even number, and I wanted to minimize how much thread I use, as this whole project is about using up leftover materials. Due to the size of the fabric I was using for lining, I had to make the panels 20 centimeters tall. I traced the shape of a single panel onto some newspaper, drew out Voltorb's monobrow and eyes, then I transferred those drawings over to some graph paper where they were then neatened up, cut them out to have stencils, and now it was time to start sewing. My original plan was to make the ball out of white scrap fabric to reduce the bleeding effect, and then make the surface which would actually depict Hisuian Voltorb. This was inspired by my impersonator build, as that was also a way to use up scrap fabric. However, on that occasion, the inner fabric and the outer fabric needed to have some autonomy from each other to make the surface baggy. On this occasion, the lining fabric and the surface fabric need to be in sync. So instead, I drew out the shape of the panel of both my lining and surface fabric, pinned them together, and then stitched the two pieces of fabric together with a zigzag stitch. The white of Voltorb's eyes were appliqued on with a zigzag stitch, and then hand embroidered on the pupils with a satin stitch. Now for the difficult part. Voltorb's monobrow. I made a strip of fabric to go around the front of the monobrow and surprisingly did a good job matching the shape. Unfortunately, I stitched the wrong sides together. But this wasn't too bad as I realized that the monobrow was actually quite thin, and the monobrow on Voltorb in the game is quite fat. So I made it again with these better proportions in mind, but on this occasion I didn't do as good of a job following the seam lines. Go figure. The monobrow was then attached to the rest of the face panel with an invisible ladder stitch, but just before I came back to the beginning of my stitching, I stopped, cut off some strips of fabric, and using a chopstick, stuffed the monobrow. Then I finished stitching, and the face was finished. For the back of the head, I just stitched some lining fabric to the surface fabric with a zigzag stitch, and then stitched the two panels together with a running stitch. Then, using a contrasting color, I put a little bit of stitching in the back to help me know where to leave an opening for stuffing. And the top half of Voltorb was finished. Now for the bottom half. I bought new fabric, new thread, new spools for my sewing machine, waited a day for the fabric I bought to be pre-washed, lined the fabric, stitched the two panels together, drew lines to know where to put satin stitching, and then this happened. Yeah. As it turns out, the presser foot I was using isn't very well suited for satin stitching, as there isn't a lot of space underneath, so the stitching gets stuck and then it just builds up and you just get this pile of thread. So I bought a presser foot that's built for satin stitching, and it was time to get back to work. The satin stitching was of varying levels of quality. The longer lines looked like how you would expect satin stitching to look, but the shorter lines were messy. There were areas where I pulled too hard and now I had a zigzag stitch, and then there were some areas where there was just no thread at all. So when I finished satin stitching by machine, I filled in the gaps by putting in some satin stitches by hand. The two halves of Voltorb's body were pinned together all the way around, and then I started stitching. This was hard as there were a lot of layers for the needle to pass through, and there were points where the seam allowance hid some pins from me, so I ended up stitching around them. But the two halves were now stitched together, and it was time for the very exciting part of turning the fabric the right way around. And yes, Voltorb's monobrow was the hardest part to get through the opening I left in the back. But the surface of the plushie was practically done. Hisuian Voltorb have a hole in the top of their heads, so I satin stitched a black spot in the top of my plushie, and now the surface was finished. I then stuffed and stitched the plushie, and that's when the entire thing was finished. Now, while I do like this as a whole, I do have mixed feelings. In trying to use up scrap fabric, I think I generated more scrap fabric. I'm also starting to think I should have used a 6-panel sphere sewing pattern and/or just made the plushie bigger, because the plushie I made looks a bit like Kermit the Frog to me. On a positive note, I like the face, and the messy satin stitching on the bottom of Voltorb's body has grown on me, as I feel it gives off a more organic look, as this is meant to be a plant. Also, Hisuian Voltorb is a happy little conker. How can you hate that? So if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to perfect the Hisuian Pokédex. Bye.